Good evening, everybody. Thank you all very much for attending, and thank you especially, of course, to Professor Walsham for being here this evening. And I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us online. I know there's a very big uptake of these lectures on the YouTube channel, and we have people participating from all over the world. So it's very exciting for us in Edinburgh to be in contact with you all, and it's a measure of the interest in this lecture series and in Professor Walsham's lectures. We have different hosts, different evenings, and this evening it's my turn. So I'm a professor here at the university. I'm a kind of sociologist. I work in the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation Studies, where we study the connection between science and society. So we have quite a historical interest, and that takes me back to some of the same period as we're talking about here today. I'm delighted to be hosting the third in this series of lectures this year. So this lecture series, and I sit on the committee of the lecture series, this lecture series tries to take forward the kind of heritage of Lord Gifford and thinking about the things that he was interested in or he would have been interested in had he been alive today. So this gives us quite a wide remit, I think. But Professor Walsham's talks are very clearly directly within that context, because what she's been doing is weaving together religious history, the history of religious change, history of religious conflict, with also the way that that is borne out in social change, the way in which people had to control and discipline their bodies, the way in which their movements were interpreted and regulated. And this evening, she's going to be talking to us about a much bigger series of movements, that is movements in terms of migrations. So today's lecture, entitled Migrations, explores one of the most profound consequences of the Reformations, the religiously motivated migrations that arose in response to conflict and persecution. So she's going to investigate and tell us about these movements through the experience of devout individuals who were forced to leave their homelands in search of safety, examining the emotional and moral dilemmas which were tied to their displacement, and the complex responses they encountered, from compassion to prejudice. The lecture would juxtapose the voluntary migrations of religious minorities with the involuntary movements linked to deportation, transportation, and enslavement. So I think that we can see there's a lot that's inherently fascinating about this history, but there's also a lot of connections to the world that we're occupying today. And I'm looking forward to both the lecture and exploring those through the questions at the end. So I'll now hand over to Professor Walsham for lecture 3. Thank you very much indeed.
Today's lecture could not be on a more topical subject. We live in an age of migrations. Images of refugees and asylum seekers are ubiquitous in newspapers, on television screens, and on the mobile devices that now pervade our lives. Around the world, people are fleeing wars, conflicts, and revolutions. They're crossing borders and oceans to escape religious persecution and ideological turmoil, and to seek safety and better opportunities for themselves and their families. In the context of environmental degradation and climate change, many more such movements will be a feature of the increasingly precarious future which is unfolding before us. The mobility of modern migrants is a vexed social and political issue. Their plight invites the sympathy and compassion of strangers and provokes generous responses to calls for humanitarian aid. But migration is also the source of tensions and fears. It fosters anger about the exploitative behavior of unscrupulous human traffickers. It stimulates economic resentment and rouses suspicion towards perceived intruders. It tests the limits of trust and integration in multicultural and multi-faith societies. It breeds concerns about extremism and terrorism, and it precipitates incidents of xenophobic hostility and racist violence. It stirs powerful emotions of all kinds, which coexist in a highly volatile mixture. Among the stories that has most affected me in recent years was the tragedy of the 7-year-old girl trampled to death in an overcrowded dinghy setting off across the English Channel from the French coast. The footage of the tiny figure perched on the shoulders of her father, wading into the shallow water to the boat, is as sharply etched in my mind as the subsequent interview with her distraught parent. It is hard to forget the combination of raw grief and intense guilt, profound desperation and ongoing hope that overflowed from him in that poignant moment. It moved me to tears. These themes and experiences are hardly unique to our times. They find many echoes in the past, including the early modern period. This too was an age of migrations, many of them connected with the religious ruptures and upheavals that fundamentally reshaped Christianity. The German historian Heiko Obermann spoke in a seminal article of the Reformation of the refugees, while Nicholas Terpstra has made exile and expulsion, together with the anxieties about purity and contagion that underpinned them, central to his alternative history of religious change between the 15th and 17th centuries. This lecture analyses the movements undertaken by people of faith in search of freedom from discrimination and a place of refuge. It investigates the conscientious dilemmas associated with religious mobility, the emotional impact of physical dislocation from one's homeland, and the competing impulses towards charity and prejudice that characterized contemporary responses to these displaced persons. While the boundaries between free and forced movement are often blurred, this is a topic that raises important questions about agency and victimhood. The final section of the lecture contrasts the voluntary migrations of religious minorities with the coerced movements involved in convict transportation and enslavement. The concepts of exile and refugee are inextricably linked with the politics of identity. The Latin root from which exile derives, exilium, denotes a condition of absence brought about by banishment. It is a legal category alluding to a judicial sentence of punishment, but over time it was applied more broadly to those who felt compelled to leave a state or territory, but did so of their own free will. It became a term of self-denomination that gave expression to an individual's sense of estrangement from their native land, and figuratively from a former self. It also has connotations of ruin, devastation, distress, and torment. The English word refugee is a borrowing from the French and refers to people who sought shelter, sanctuary, and retreat in foreign countries. It denotes those who take flight from one location to another in the hope of finding asylum. In the early modern period, asylum was a space offering protection from the law. Only later was it used to describe the formal permission granted to citizens of another nation concerned for their safety if they remained there. Early modern Christianity was responsible for sparking a new phase in the history of mass migration. The imperative of enforcing religious uniformity and removing false believers led to the formal expulsion of the Jews from Spain and Portugal in the 1490s, ending centuries of convivencia. A similar ultimatum to convert or leave was given to Iberian Muslims in 1502. While their movements to Northern and Eastern Europe and other locations in the Mediterranean are an important chapter in the story, I focus here on those who left home because of the schism within Christendom. confessionalizing states intent upon purging themselves of the contaminating presence of heretics and idolaters ordered them to depart from their realms. But the number of Lutherans, Calvinists, Anabaptists, and Catholics who did so in response to such edicts is overshadowed by the thousands more who chose to go of their own accord. Many were driven by fear of persecution, if not execution, if they were detected and arrested. Sometimes their sojourn in exile proved short-lived, as in England, where Mary I's death in 1558 enabled Protestants who'd sought refuge in Frankfurt, Strasbourg, Zurich, and Geneva to return to rebuild the Elizabethan Church. Others took to the road to evade the devastating wars of religion in 16th century France and the Low Countries, relocating to places where they could practice their religion more freely. In the 17th century, the resurgent counter-reformations in many parts of the Holy Roman Empire, including Bohemia and Austria, and the devastations wrought by the ensuing 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, drove new religiously motivated migrations. Mennonite and Hutterite communities spread from the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland into Poland, Prussia, and Russia, from whence some moved to North America. Louis XIV's intimidating policy of quartering troops, the dragonnade, in Protestant households to coerce them to convert was the final straw for some. His determination to rid his absolutist kingdom of heresy culminated in the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which drove around 150,000 Huguenots to leave France for destinations in Britain, the United Provinces, Canada, the Caribbean, Suriname, and South Africa. In 1709, many German-speaking Protestants fled fighting in the Palatinate. Many crossed the Channel to England, lured by the offer of refuge and free land in North America. In 1731-2, another 20,000 people of the Reformed faith were expelled from the bishopric of Salzburg. These large-scale movements of people across frontiers and seas were accompanied by forms of displacement linked with the fracturing of emerging orthodoxies. The radical separatists who forsook the Church of England for Dutch cities such as Amsterdam and Leiden in the decades between 1580 and 1630 were determined to distance themselves from the institutions engendered by what they saw as a false Reformation intent upon persecuting them. The Puritans who crossed the Atlantic to found the Plymouth colony in 1620 did so against the backdrop of the Laudian drive to silence dissent. Their physical emigration symbolized their ecclesiastical schism. The practice of Auslauf, which means running out, involved shorter journeys to worship in neighboring cities and territories in the Holy Roman Empire. The day trips to toleration taken by these temporary exiles and partial refugees are another ingredient in the mobility that reflected and reinforced the spread of religious pluralism in post-Reformation Europe. In pursuit of the truth, many abandoned the worlds they knew, borne up by optimism that they would be able to return soon. Exile was and is an ambivalent emotional experience. The impulse to escape physical danger and spiritual pollution was always in tension with continuing affection for one's homeland. Torn between feelings of hope and loss, those who took the momentous step of leaving their countries were Janus-faced figures who looked both forward and backward. The preoccupation of earlier historians with disentangling the religious and economic incentives that lay behind early modern migrations now seems misguided. This unhelpful binary is rooted in the historic separation of reason and affect that is largely a byproduct of the Enlightenment, but which some strands of Reformation polemic also stimulated. Instead, we must investigate how contemporaries interpreted and were transformed by the confusing and unsettling experience of exile, the narratives and myths they wove around it, and the emotions they felt on the move. Lutherans who engaged in confessional migration in the context of the religious fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire developed a distinct understanding of their mobility. In describing themselves as exultant, they actively embraced the status of outcast implied by the original Latin term. For them, exile was a state of mind intricately linked with the notion that Christian life is a pilgrimage, within which one will pass through periods of suffering and trial. Their ordeal was neither righteous nor salvific, but in accordance with Luther's theology of the cross, a gift from God that signified their justification by grace and that could advance them towards sanctification. Lutherans consoled themselves that the Lord counted every step in their flight and thought of the tribulation linked with displacement as a temporary test of their faith. Catholics who departed from Protestant territories in England, Scotland, and the Netherlands were also shaped by their displacement to Italy, the Low Countries, and Spain. Being émigrés gave them a strong sense of affinity with Mary and Joseph's journey from Bethlehem. Their movement to new environments served as a catalyst to confessional clarity. This had paradoxical effects. It both radicalized them and encouraged Irenicism. It fueled forms of Catholic militancy that formed the bedrock of a vigorous counter-Reformation in the Habsburg Low Countries and triggered a collective response to the Dutch revolt. The travels of mid-16th century English clerics exposed them to fresh currents of thinking that encouraged them to engage in constructive interconfessional dialogue and open themselves up to the possibility of reconciliation. It contributed to the creation of theologies and spiritualities that were as fluid as they were plural. For British lay people who joined convents and religious houses established on the continent, exile was an integral step in realizing their vocation. It was a mental act of detachment that made them dead to the secular world. This was an outlook shared by some who stayed at home, who retreated into an inner exile that reflected their sorrow about the havoc wrought by the break with Rome. In 1574, the English priest Richard Bristow invoked the lachrymose language of Scripture to give expression to his distress at the ruin of the true religion. We must bitterly weep, sob, and sigh to remember Zion and the temple of our mother Jerusalem. In his eyes, England had exiled itself from the faith of Christ. Calvinists were temperamentally well suited to the condition of exile. The doctrine of predestination fostered the feeling of being part of a beleaguered but blessed minority. It strengthened the conviction that the Reformed were God's new chosen people in succession to the ancient Israelites, whose exodus out of Egypt and Babylonian captivity provided the biblical lens through which they explicated their own experiences. Widely depicted in biblical engravings, Noah's construction of the ark and the escape of Lot and his family from Sodom, led by angels, were other popular models for seeking refuge from divine wrath. In 1631, the Chelmsford preacher Thomas Hooker told his congregation that God was packing up his gospel, preparing to forsake an ungrateful nation, and beginning to create a refuge for his Noahs and Lots, a rock and shelter for his righteous ones to run unto in New England. Above all, though, Reformed Protestant migrations were animated by the apocalyptic injunction in Revelation 18:4 to leave the habitations of devils and cage of unclean and hateful birds that was Babylon. Many felt called by the verse, "Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues." Being part of a diasporic community intensified Calvinists' sense of belonging to the remnant of the elect and fostered a propensity to see the guiding hand of God at work in their peregrinations. They revelled in thinking of themselves as uprooted wayfarers. Calvin's own flight from France to Geneva was a template for their own dislocation. His description of how the misery of exile would be turned to joy when the Lord breathed upon his children was a source of comfort to Calvinists seeking assurance of their salvation, as well as the meaning of their current adversities. The empowering discourses that surrounded religious migration played a vital role in shaping individual subjectivities and group identities. They open a window into what may be called the emotionology of exile. The biblical paradigms that gave displaced people solace also invested them with pride in the acts of self-sacrifice they'd made in leaving their families, friends, and possessions behind to live as strangers in foreign lands. They helped to justify decisions that were in fact fraught with moral angst. Minorities from across the confessional spectrum were troubled about the legitimacy of flight. The competing positions of the church fathers Athanasius and Tertullian were often rehearsed in the casuistical literature that circulated in post-Reformation Europe. Such texts attest to the considerable qualms that many members of persecuted communities felt about voluntary exodus. Should one stay despite the danger of persecution and even death? Could one go into exile to keep one's conscience pure and undefiled? Was it cowardly and uncharitable to abandon one's co-religionists in perilous times, especially if one was a minister? Or was there spiritual wisdom in seeking self-preservation to sustain the faith until the appointed time of its revival? Could failing to take advantage of the means of escape provided by a merciful God even tempt and offend him? And did this constitute an act of desertion of the prince and patria to which one owed allegiance? The predicaments surrounding exile paralleled those linked with how to behave during outbreaks of epidemic disease. According to John Knox, false religion was a form of infection that one should flee when called upon to do so by God. "Pass from her, O my people," he wrote, "that ye be not partakers of her plagues." For him, as for Calvin, this was a far more honourable strategy than outward conformity or dissimulation. Knox's confidence about the rectitude of taking refuge overseas contrasts with the grief of mind that evidently afflicted others. The extended letter on religious mobility, which the Italian Calvinist and Edwardian professor of divinity at Oxford, Peter Martyr Vermigli, sent to a friend, underlines the duty of embracing martyrdom when one has a clear vocation. It presents flight as a type of confession itself, but it is also striking for its sensitive exploration of the psychology of fear as an affect of the mind. It probes the inward motions that stir the heart of the believer and considers the circumstances in which one might follow them without indulging the lusts of the flesh. The Puritan divine Samuel Torshall was similarly attentive to the dilemma of knowing when to depart and when to remain, and how to navigate the feelings of shame and guilt, inward terror and trembling, weakness, irresolution, and unbelief that confronted the devout. For those who'd previously succumbed to the pressure to compromise, going into exile was a purifying experience that helped settle their consciences and regenerate their souls. It was an act of repentance that they remembered with intermingled remorse and gratitude. Jean Migaud's memoir of his deliverance from persecution recalled how he'd abjured under pressure in prison at La Rochelle, and how the horror of his sin had so overcome him that he went almost mad from despair. His contrition took the form of a heart beating violently and intense weeping. He thanked God for showing him mercy and leading him to refuge in Holland. The Huguenots were a tearful diaspora. In others, exile encouraged an element of self-congratulation. When Pierre Varin, a hatter from Rouen who fled to Rotterdam in 1685, wrote to his brother urging him to leave Babylon, he deplored those who'd bowed before Baal and abjured. The same sentiments, he said, they cared too much for the onions of Egypt and did not want to leave for the love of Christ. The same sentiments can be detected in the memoir of the Protestant gentlewoman Rose Hickman, who left England for Antwerp with her husband during the reign of Mary I. Written when she was in her 80s, it recalls how she'd accounted nothing in comparison of liberty of conscience, and how she'd reprimanded her sister for her reluctance to leave for the covetousness of her worldly goods, and warned her that the Lord's hand will be upon you for it. Safely on the other side, some of those who'd taken the bold step of forsaking their homeland could not help but feel superior to those who'd stayed behind. The sobering fate of Lot's wife, who looked back wistfully to the burning city of Sodom and was fossilized into a pillar of salt, reminded them that stasis was sinful when the Lord commanded movement. Those, like Rose Hickman, who subsequently returned when regime change occurred, were keen to retain the aristocracy of suffering and the patina of martyrdom that their self-imposed absence conferred. In a process of self-fashioning that involved much selective forgetting, they carefully crafted their reputation as heroic victims. Life after exile, as Fred Smith has put it, also entailed allaying suspicions of desertion and disloyalty, treachery and betrayal. English Catholics who came back to assist with the Marian Counter-Reformation cultivated a myth of banishment that absolved them of responsibility for their decision to leave and displaced it onto the Protestant authorities. Cardinal Reginald Pole described himself as a banished man and stressed the pain of being deprived of my native country, saying nothing is more grievous to the heart of man. Was not this a piteous state, he asked, and a state of extreme calamity? He invoked a rhetoric of nostalgia that mimicked the intense yearning for home that many exiles felt. The Latin inscription on the tombstone of Robert Peckham tells us that he left England because he could not live in his country without the faith, and having come to Rome, died there because he could not live apart from his country. Nostalgia was experienced as a bodily phenomenon. It manifested itself in physical illness as well as mental unease. The Swiss physician Johannes Hofer coined the term to describe the fatal malady of homesickness in 1688. Sadness for what they had abandoned compelled some émigrés to return to their birthplace, though when they got there, some were afflicted by a form of withdrawal in reverse. The merchant Nehemiah Bourne looked back from London to the New World, not altogether without some breathings and longings in 1640. And when the Puritan Stephen Winthrop returned from the New World to take a commission in the Parliamentary Army in 1647, he hankered for it, commenting, "I have no health here." More generally, memory was a vital dimension in the emotional communities that formed around exile. The manuscript chronicle of the English Poor Clares of Rouen compared them with poor pilgrims seeking hospitality in a strange country, and the illuminated history of the Bridgertines depicted the painful vicissitudes to which the order had been subject since 1539. Protestants likewise polished the heroic legends about the reformation of the refugees that they passed down to posterity. None more so than the Pilgrim Fathers of New England, whose errand into the wilderness and the promised land of Canaan has become the centerpiece of American patriotic legend. The very process by which immigrants assimilated themselves into their host societies and made the transition from stranger to citizen was emotionally challenging. It involved straddling two worlds and balancing the pull of one's place of origin with the draw exerted by one's destination. This mid-16th century French Bible, which contains a genealogical register of the children born to the Mobillot family of St. Martin's in the Fields between 1665 and 1680, is written in English. The entries written in English attest to the family's linguistic integration into its host society. With the lapse of time and the passage of the generations, the very real hardships associated with displacement faded and became inherited traditions viewed through rose-tinted spectacles. John Lamotte, alderman and elder of the Dutch Church of Austin Friars in London, had been born in Colchester, but he recounted the persecutions of his ancestors and co-religionists in France and the Low Countries in so punctual a manner as if he had been an eyewitness, yea, a sharer in them. He remembered with particular admiration and thankfulness how God had inclined his father to choose England for his place of refuge. The Congregationalist minister Giles Say, who was ejected from his Southampton living for nonconformity in 1662, kept evidence of his family's Huguenot heritage. On the flyleaf of a book given to him by his dying brother, he recorded how his maternal grandparents, who were of the French seed, had fled from Normandy at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign. This slip of paper, lovingly preserved by his son Samuel in the family archive, became an heirloom. Like the Mobillot Bible, it is an object freighted with feeling. We must now turn from the emotions felt by those who emigrated to those they provoked in the communities that received them. Then, as now, the arrival of what were called aliens was a cause of economic and social resentment. Especially in times of crisis and political upheaval, they proved to be useful scapegoats. As on Evil May Day, 1517, they were the target of a range of accusations, including claims that their presence contributed to food shortages, inflation, rent rises, vagrancy, and crime. In England, skilled Huguenot and Walloon artisans were the subject of much murmuring and grudging talk. In 1595, a petition drawn up by the journeyman weavers of London complained that they were disobedient subjects and bad neighbours, and declared that we nourish serpents in our bosoms who sting us to the heart. Others branded them seditious spirits and dismissed them as hypocrites. Protestant strangers were sometimes suspected of being spies or papists in disguise. And in 1666, rumours circulated that they deliberately ignited the Great Fire of London. Hostility to foreigners could translate into threats, which sometimes spilled over into violence and led to attacks on the meeting houses, homes, and workplaces of asylum seekers. The Dutch chapel in the Isle of Axholme in Lincolnshire was desecrated in 1650-1, when opponents of fen drainage also destroyed over 80 houses of the strangers involved in ambitious schemes of land reclamation. A petition from the victims complained of the barbarous and inhumane manner in which their assailants had acted in demolishing their habitations, exposing them to the extremity of cold and famine. In a later incident, Protestant apprentices planned to pull down a pest house being used as temporary accommodation for refugees, though this was thwarted by the authorities. Anxious not to attract negative attention, the Huguenot community was urged to stop its children from making noise in the street and to curtail drinking and wild behaviour, lest they offend those living adjacent to them. These refugees were living in fear. In 1709, the influx of poor Palatines was accompanied by fears that they were introducing smallpox and stealing bread from the poor. Bills for the naturalization of aliens repeatedly failed. Opponents worried that they would serve as nest eggs of a foreign invasion, a fifth column that would subvert the nation from within. Xenophobia could be tinged with a hint of ethnic hatred, as in the statement that granting rights of citizenship to strangers would go a great way to blot out and extinguish the English race. Replicated across Reformation Europe, such incidents remind us that the anti-immigration riots we witnessed in Britain last summer are part of a recurring pattern of prejudice against perceived outsiders. On the other hand, early modern migrants also benefited from charity and compassion. Shortly after settling in Louvain, the English Augustinian sisters received alms from a local beguine, eager to help those who are, alas, strangers out of your own country. The Huguenot refugee Jacques Fontaine fondly remembered the kindness and friendship he was shown when he arrived in Barnstable in 1685, when one of the inhabitants welcomed him and a dozen co-religionists into their home, recalling how God had thereby provided us with fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters among strangers. John Lamotte was praised for his sympathizing bowels and his swift response to calls for the assistance of Protestants in distress, as well as for soliciting others to do the same. Encompassed in Christ's command to love thy neighbour, the duty of hospitality was defined as an amalgam of affectum and effectum, affection and action, well-willing and well-doing. Its components and cousins, compassion and sympathy, were understood as visceral emotional practices that sprang from the bowels of human mercy. They were believed to begin in the guts. Contemporaries described the bodily movements that caused these inward sensations and enabled them to relate to the afflictions of their co-religionists. The Dutch deacons in the town of Wessel, who wrote letters requesting help from elsewhere, described the sufferings of sisters and babies, the hungry and the thirsty, the naked and the sick, the poor widows and orphans, in terms that they hoped would move even a stone heart. Prayers and tears were part of a spiritual and emotional economy which was credited with powerful effects. As a Massachusetts divine, Samuel Sewall, declared in 1698, it could have efficacy in shaking and shattering anti-Christian walls at the greatest distance. The Christian sentiments that underpin these examples may seem to reflect timeless values, but the limits of fellow feeling in this and indeed other periods must be stressed. The pity that people felt was often constrained within their own families and households of faith. Compassion was a byproduct of confessional solidarity. It was a differential theology with an inherently exclusionary dimension. It entailed discriminating between those who deserved aid as one's brethren in Christ and those who did not as the acolytes of Satan. As Catherine Ibbott has shown in an important study of France, compassion had an edge that kept the recipient at arm's length. Its effective undertow was marked by forms of partisanship that reaffirmed the polemical categories into which contemporaries divided their world. The concept of sympathy was similarly double-edged. In Puritan circles, the mutual affection that the godly extended to their fellow saints defined the boundaries of belonging and demarcated who was in and who was out. It was thus entirely compatible with the opposing sentiments of antagonism and intolerance. A sermon preached by Bishop Gilbert Burnet in 1704, calling for charity to the persecuted Protestant exiles of the Principality of Orange in 1704, thus invoked the inhumane and barbarous fury of the Catholic Church and its Bourbon patron in France. The universal ring of the language of humanity it employed occludes the anti-Catholicism that suffused it. The international networks that organised collections for the relief of Calvinists across Europe likewise appealed to their fellow Protestants to intervene to rescue them from the evils of Romish tyranny. Modern humanitarianism is often seen as a consequence of the Enlightenment and contrasted sharply with the confessional forms of refugee relief that mark the 16th and 17th centuries. It's linked with the declining intensity of the religious passions unleashed by the Reformation, the emergence of new sensibilities, and the philosophical interventions of figures such as Adam Smith, David Hume, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which stressed human benevolence. Lynn Hunt attributed the emergence of human rights thinking in the 18th century to a new emotional regime, which centered on imagined empathy. But recent work is refining this picture. It's pointing to continuities with the past and identifying new genealogies for humanitarian activity and feeling that find some of their roots in fellow feeling for religious refugees. It's showing how the story of the Good Samaritan could sometimes be mobilized to advance a more far-reaching vision of charity and hospitality that made no distinctions about the cause of one's misery and extended it to all victims, regardless of their sectarian affiliation, including non-Christians such as Jews. Among them were the exiled Huguenot ministers Caleb Deillechamps and Ezekiel Carré, who wrote their books entitled Christian Hospitality and The Charitable Samaritan from Refuge in 1632 and 1689, respectively. True piety, they declared, began with a heart touched by compassion for the trials of all human beings, though both hedged this about with the qualifications that reflected that their discriminatory theology of sympathy and the resilience of the model of confessional solidarity that shaped charity in this period. As David de Boer has shown, campaigns against persecution in the Dutch press increasingly adopted a deconfessionalized language to attract transnational support, experimenting with more inclusive rhetorics and emotive vocabularies that test traditional narratives of development. They mobilized stories about the refugee crisis precipitated by the revocation of the Edict of Nantes to call for aid in an attempt to make their readers care about distant suffering. Confessional condemnation of Catholic atrocities coexisted with appeals to human solidarity. Shared feeling for the plight of strangers forced to flee transcended sectarian boundaries, but this was not a function of the triumph of Enlightenment universalism or the cooling down of religious tensions. Rather, it grew out of those same conflicts, and it could still be used as a tool of marginalization and exclusion. If the moral outrage it stimulated attracted charitable contributions from unexpected quarters, it also often failed to translate into action. A further indication of the complex origins of humanitarianism comes in the form of the Huguenot campaign to secure the release of co-religionists sentenced to hard labour as galley slaves for refusing to convert to Catholicism in the 1690s. Turning to natural law and theories of toleration, they argued for intervention on the grounds that all human beings had moral obligations to each other and that none deserved to be subject to bodily suffering. The torments inflicted upon them were invoked to foster the sympathy of those who take the oppression of Zion to heart. But it also extended to Muslims and Catholics, alongside whom they were chained in the boats. These tendencies contributed to discourses and practices that deserve to be recognized among the legacies of religious exile and diaspora. Simultaneously, however, they sit alongside other currents of thinking that serve to foster schemes for colonization and sought to settle migrants overseas. Hence the suggestion that Ireland could provide a haven for the reformed Waldensians fleeing massacre in the valleys of Piedmont in the 1650s, and the establishment of colonies for poor Palatines in the Bahamas, Jamaica, North Carolina, and New York in the 18th century. There they set about building a series of new Edens that are themselves part of the story of incipient European imperialism. In this way, drives to provide persecuted minorities on the move with places of refuge and asylum were closely entangled with the emergence of empire. The last section of this lecture turns from the voluntary movements of migrants and exiles to the coerced movements of convicts and enslaved peoples. The deportation or banishment of deviants has a long European history. It was a strategy for removing the presence of undesirables who jeopardized the moral purity and spiritual unity of a Christian state and simultaneously posed a threat to social and political order. In early modern Britain, for instance, the government frequently ordered Jesuits, seminary priests, and other religious dissidents to depart out of their kingdoms, never to return hither again until they'd reformed themselves. A proclamation issued by the Lord Deputy of Ireland, Henry Falkland, in 1622, ordered the banishment of wandering Scottishmen who were arriving without warrant and were pestering and disturbing the northern plantations of the island. Some of these fugitives were fleeing justice after having committed notorious crimes. The penalty of transportation to an overseas settlement was a 17th century development, which served a double purpose. It exported unwanted criminals and simultaneously responded to the need for agricultural labour in the emerging Atlantic colonies. This included vagrants who could be sentenced to it under the 1662 Settlement Act, which was itself an attempt to police the growing population of the poor. It was also a convenient means of dealing with political prisoners and religious nonconformists. Under the Conventicle Act of 1664, seditious sectaries could be transported on the third offence, on pain of being judged a felon if they returned. The Quakers revelled in being subjected to this unjust penalty and celebrated their providential deliverances en route to the New World. After the Jacobite Rising of 1746, rebels convicted of treason were sent to plantations, again with the warning that if they came back, they would be executed. Ironically, transportation gathered momentum at the same time as schemes to offer asylum to religious refugees. Enforced movement was the alter ego of free movement. As the jurist William Blackstone would later put it, personal liberty consisted in the power of locomotion without imprisonment or restraint. This process was systematized under the Transportation Act of 1717, which paved the way for the shipment of between 50 and 120,000 convicts overseas for a period of indentured servitude before 1776, when the American Revolution led to its temporary suspension. After a brief pause until 1787, it resumed with a new destination, Australia. This form of penal mobility was part of a burgeoning global trade in unfree labour. It swept up a vast array of petty criminals, from burglars and pickpockets to perjurers and counterfeiters. The picaresque adventures of some became the subject of friction, as in the case of Daniel Defoe's Moll Flanders. Other publications purported to offer true histories of those who'd been transported but found their way back, like the so-called flying highwayman, William Hawke. Virtue Triumphant described the ordeal of Elizabeth Canny, a poor serving girl wrongfully convicted of false swearing against a gypsy, who accepted her sentence with the meekness and humility befitting a martyr. As she watched the shoreline of England disappear into the distance, a torrent of tears gushed from her eyes, while her heart felt all the emotions of nature. The words of the edifying speech she made from the deck of the ship taking her to America made the sailors on board weep. 18th century audiences were invited to feel pity and sympathy for the victims of judicial severity. Transportation was, in fact, a form of mercy. It was a legal mitigation and commutation of the death sentences for felons whose crimes were not deemed capital offences. It was an act of pardon and clemency, directly bestowed by the prerogative of the monarch. It was akin to declarations of indulgence and grants of religious toleration. Indeed, Huguenots deported to the West Indies after 1685 were not sold as indentured servants, but given land to induce them to put down roots. It encompassed the possibility that the convict could be rehabilitated. It was envisaged as a means of achieving their moral recuperation and of relieving the state of a plague of idle and criminal people, though many thwarted this by returning home. In 1725, the Dutch physician and philosopher Bernard Mandeville, who had emigrated to England in 1693, controversially recommended deterring this by handing felons over to servitude in the Ottoman galleys in exchange for Christian captives repressed under the yoke of infidels. This, he said, would have the effect of ridding the country of the vermin of society, while also performing the most charitable action in the world. Mandeville was prone to burlesque, but these sentiments were consistent with his moral philosophy, which saw contrary impulses as interdependent and identified human passions and vices as agents of public good, happiness, and prosperity. While this provocative suggestion failed to gain traction, it demonstrates that transportation must also be situated on a continuum with other forms of carceral mobility. Louis XIV's drive to expand the French naval fleet led him to order the courts to sentence men to serve in these hulks as a substitute for the death penalty, as well as to utilize it as a deterrent for those who stubbornly refused to repudiate the Protestant heresy. Prisoners of war had long been deployed as rowers, including John Knox, after French galleys besieged St Andrew's Castle and captured him in 1547. The legal status of prisoners of war was ambiguous and shifting. They were both enemies and fellow human beings whose lives should be spared. The petitions they sent to the authorities seeking relief were filled with claims about unwarrantable cruelty and barbarous usage. They became the recipients of organized philanthropic initiatives that dwelt on the traditional morality of Christian charity and drew in donations from the rich, but also from those of humble means, including the two poor women who gave 1 shilling 6pence in Bristol in 1759. Accordingly, these involuntary migrants were the subject of ambivalent feelings. They attracted public and private benevolence, but they also channeled animosity towards foreign powers whose alleged proclivity for violence was rooted in the mutually reinforcing black legends of Catholic and Protestant tyranny. Hilary Carey's study of the 18th and 19th century campaign to end convict transportation highlights the similar paradox that religious arguments both empowered the development of overseas penal settlements as reformative colonies that performed the work of human redemption, and also fueled efforts to bring an end to these emanations of what one writer called the empire of hell. This brings us finally to the coerced movement that lay at the heart of the transatlantic slave trade. The emergence of slavery as an engine of the global economy was a product of a triangular matrix of economic forces involving supply and demand. The 8 million Africans transported across the Atlantic Ocean between 1500 and 1800 provided the manpower needed to produce the necessities required by settlers in America, and the luxury consumer goods, including coffee and sugar, coveted by Europeans. It was a highly lucrative trade that depended on the cooperation of local and foreign actors. It turned Africans into human cargo and transformed their laboring bodies into valuable chattels. The scale of these forced migrations dwarfs those undertaken freely. Many of those who acquired slaves in America and the Caribbean in this period were themselves migrants. Some were refugees, including Huguenots who settled in North Carolina after 1685, who accepted slavery and even saw it as a measure of their prosperity in the colony. Others were Dutch Calvinists and German Lutherans. The early Quakers rarely questioned its morality, the morality of slavery. Only later did they emerge as outspoken prohibitionists. Protestantism, as well as Catholicism, was complicit in the commerce that underpinned the practice of enslavement. The process by which Europeans and emigres began to question the ethics of slavery, criticize the forced exportation of innocent people, and feel sympathy for those subjected to it is beyond the scope of this lecture. But some of its seeds lie in the Christian values of charity that facilitated transnational and cross-confessional support for exiles. We catch a glimpse of this in 3 sermons delivered by the Plymouth preacher Charles Fitzgeoffrey in October 1636, which were published under the title of Compassion Towards Captives. This was a call to his Devon congregation to commiserate and relieve their countrymen and brethren in miserable bondage in the Babylon of Barbary. These were mariners seized and enslaved by the Turkish pirates in the Mediterranean. Fitzgeoffrey said that the true Christian would have a sense of fellow suffering with his co-religionists, and declared that to have no feeling for their trials at the hands of the Ottomans was to be in thraldom to the devil. He implored his auditors to consider those deprived of what he called the breathing death of liberty, and to give generously to redeem them from captivity. The arms of the mind had to be combined with the arms of the hand. True affection was always linked with action. Fitzgeoffrey's aim was to move his hearers to do this. He said that a Christian would hardly see without grief the sufferings of Muslims, but he also railed against them as monsters and declared that captives who'd renounced Christ and turned Turk deserved no compassion. This was an indictment of slavery grounded in the religious theory of sympathy, but it only extended to members of his own faith. It carried an undertone of contempt and established a hierarchy of people who deserved pity. Nonetheless, it illustrates the role that religious activism played in laying the foundations for long-distance advocacy, even before the era studied by Peter Stamatov in The Origins of Global Humanitarianism. The same sentiments are also implicit in the writings of the Danish Moravian missionary Christian Georg Andreas Oldendorp, who travelled to the Caribbean in 1766 to convert the African slave population. He understood savagery as synonymous with excessive emotion and instinctive violence, but his Moravian theology of the heart and exposure to emerging philosophical trends also led him to stress the shared humanity of slaves and slaveholders, and to analyse slavery as a system of emotional coercion. In his words, it was the mother of many sins and gives cause for malice, stubbornness, disobedience, revenge, as well as injustice and inhumanity. Significantly, the key passages in his ethnography of the mission were edited out by his superiors. Moravians in other colonies assured planters that they would uphold the doctrine of the Christian submission of enslaved people. But the radical egalitarianism of their spirituality provided ammunition to challenge the brutality of slavery. They foreshadow some elements of the full-blown abolitionist movement. This deliberately exploited feelings of compassion to galvanize politicians to effect lasting legislative change. One image that assisted in doing so was this diagram of the slave ship Brooks. The sentiments that this illustration and other texts stimulated helped people to realize the horror of the Middle Passage, but experienced from afar, they also arguably detached and absolved them from direct responsibility. They reinforced difference and they remained contingent. The inner lives and emotions of the slaves themselves leave little trace in the historical record. The silence of the archive is the product of deliberate colonial erasure and a manifestation of the violence that commodified and dehumanized them. The physical and mental impact of forced movement cannot be recovered. Some have suggested that the only way we can overcome this impasse is through the empathetic act of imagination. The sensitivity with which scholars such as Marcus Rediker, Marisa Fuentes and Maria Montalvo have done so is as harrowing as it is persuasive. They write counter-histories that confront the problem of the unspeakable, involve the interaction of the fictive and the historical, and employ the technique of critical fabulation. Their books are methodological and ethical projects that test the limits of our discipline's mantra of empiricism. They're self-consciously presented as a gesture towards redress and a history of the present. They acknowledge that the subjects they study obliterate the possibility of objectivity and risk emotional strength. They urge us to recognize a different poetics of history, and they invite us to work for social justice. However, we should remind ourselves that these efforts to overcome archival silence and peer into the heart of darkness rely on assumptions derived from Western ideas that may not align with the thought worlds of the enslaved. We need to recover the concepts of mind and body embedded in the cultures of the men and women transported on the slave ships, and how they understood the workings of what early modern Europeans called the affects and the passions. We have yet to investigate what it meant for them to feel moved in both senses of that resonant word. And in doing so, we have to overcome the racializing discourse used by slavery's apologists to justify their treatment. The idea that black people did not experience the same emotions as white people. This is the thought-provoking note on which it feels appropriate to end this lecture. Today, I've investigated the religious roots and ramifications of voluntary and coerced migrations. I turn next to explore conversions. I shall assess how contemporaries conceptualized internal translations of the soul, consider the external missions that were launched to bring them about, and probe the emotional dimension of the religious transformations that were such a conspicuous feature of the early modern era. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was wonderful. Really fantastically informative and also just beautifully culminating in an overall argument. So the opportunity now, I'm afraid not available to people watching online, is to ask questions. So Louise is going to come around and look after the microphone. And what I'd invite people to do, if you'd like to ask a question, is to put your hand up and then I'll try to establish some kind of contact with you. Louise can bring you the mic. We need you to be speaking to the mic for the people watching online. If you want to say who you are, that's fine. You don't have to. You can ask anonymously. And so let me just see if there's anybody who'd like to start the questions. If not, there's something I'd like to ask about, and then we can move on. So I think one of the things that that I hadn't worked out was going to be important for the people was this issue of justifying their departure. So you know, so is this a test that God is submitting me to that I should stay and cope with, or should I go? And so where did they go to in their thinking about those issues? I mean, so, you know, were there manuals or the scripture and so on?
Yes,
so how did they wrestle with that?
Yes, so as I mentioned, these were not new questions. They go back to the sort of early period of Christianity. But they constantly recur, and there are sort of casuistical manuals that deal with these cases of conscience, along with many others. Should you, attend church and compromise your faith if you're living in a country where the religion is not the one you hold. So these moral dilemmas are very much the subject of frequent contemporary discussion among devout people. And of course, it's a complex calculus to work that out. Mm-hmm. It's often said that Calvin himself, an exile in Geneva,
yes,
could see the value and the legitimacy of exile, mm-hmm. By contrast with some of those who stayed and
yes.
Suffered and faced persecution.
Yes. And then I guess people have a strong motivation to express their discomfort and suffering in exile.
Yes.
So that
right.
it doesn't come
Absolutely.
across as them having
Yes, they construct their exile as itself a trial and
yes.
a suffering, as a form of martyrdom itself. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Anybody? The lady in the jacket, the back, and then we'll come to the gentleman in front.
Thank you, Alex, for an extraordinary wide-ranging lecture. I have a very simple question. Could you say a little bit more about Europe's Jewish populations, whether that's a population that we need to understand their movements as unique in Europe and different from the communities that you've already spoken about? And can you say a little bit more about how Jewish populations on the move are received in different parts of Europe? We might often see that reception as a hostile one, but some of the things you've been saying about compassion and mercy, does that also apply
Absolutely.
to those populations?
Thank you. You will have noted, Laura, that I said at the start that I didn't have space for that, but I'm glad to have the opportunity to say a little more about that now. I mean, as I said at the beginning, the expulsions of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula in the late 15th century set in train this wide diaspora of Jews across Europe, and the history of the Jews in this period is a mixture of persecution and toleration. In the cities of the Netherlands, they live in relative comfort and freedom, but still surrounded by an anxiety about unchristian belief. As some will know, in the 1650s, Oliver Cromwell oversees discussions about the readmission of Jews to England. That isn't formally granted, but it does allow a kind of informal flow of more Jewish people into England. I think the one thing I would say that I think is important and will come up a little more in the next lecture is that, of course, what happens over the course of the early modern period is a growing concern about whether those Jews who've remained in the Iberian Peninsula and converted in order to stay are true and sincere converts, and that creates a suspicion about whether they can be converted at all. And so that is one dimension, but it coexists with, for example, in Protestant circles, a strong sense, as you've already seen, of affinity with the ancient Jews, and that's part of the equation that's creating, I suppose a keynote of what I've been saying is this deep ambivalence at the same time.
The gentleman on the aisle here.
Thank you. I was interested in your three-way classification of the different kinds of migration. Isn't there a fourth one? People who internally migrate by changing their religion. They
Yes.
don't actually leave the country.
Yes.
Does that fit in with your classification model?
That's an excellent point, and one of the reasons why I didn't discuss that today was that will be the subject of Monday's lecture.
Okay.
Yeah. So perhaps if you could wait until then. Yeah.
Two at the front here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a lecture that's so richly generative of so much thinking. I was wondering, in your research, if you found any evidence of forces or thinking that was related to eschatology or apocalypticism. Texts like, when you see the abomination of death, flee to the mountains, or the elect will be called out of every nation. So I wonder how those eschatological ideas ferment or feed this drive for migration.
Absolutely. I mean, you will have seen me mention how important Revelation is, especially in Calvinist circles. And it plays an important role, as a number of scholars have shown, in the American migrations too. And also it plays an important role, going back to the question of the readmission of the Jews in the mid-17th century, is this notion that we're about to see the end of the world, and the conversion of the Jews is a necessary prelude to that process. So yes, eschatology is hugely important.
First of all, thank you very much indeed for that lecture. I mean, in talking about migration, and I'm particularly thinking about that which is done voluntarily, I mean, some of the remarks you made seem to imply that it were some of the more upper reaches of society that engaged in this. And I was wondering if you could say something about how financially this was accomplished. Because presumably the people who went didn't carry travellers' cheques, but there would be some means of international banking that enabled this to take place. And I just wonder how was this accomplished?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm not sure I'm equipped to answer a question on the economics of migration. The gold chain. The gold chain. Yeah. Tell us, Jane. Yeah. Yes, indeed. Absolutely. I think also that actually, for example, Rose Hickman that I mentioned, the woman who goes into exile in Antwerp with her husband. It's really striking that she goes to Antwerp, which is a Catholic city, not a Protestant one, and that's because of the connections of her husband with the mercantile trade. So she has a whole new dilemmas in Antwerp. Can she baptize her child in a Catholic church and so on? So there is a kind of economics, and I said too how any attempt to sort of unravel the motivations, religious or economic, mercantile or mercenary and devotion is perhaps not entirely helpful. I think that sense that people are part of networks who can support them financially is important here. Yeah.
Okay. We have two. The young lady in the white top maybe has no. Okay. And then the gentleman in the fancy glasses.
So I'm not very good at putting my thoughts in order, but thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. It's a bit about if you have a sense of exile and you have a desire to return to a particular homeland, what do you think that can tell us about maybe early modern ideas of a nationality or nationhood, or do they have a desire to return to a defined sense of a nation that they feel they have a right to be in and a right to live in, or do they just simply want to return as part of a larger Christian brotherhood and spreading it's their duty to spread the faith regardless of a sense of nation?
That's an excellent question. I think it's kind of evolving, and it's a little bit of both. But I think I'd draw your attention to the way in which they're sort of paradoxically, those who go into exile think it's not so much them going into exile, it's their country that's gone into exile from the true faith, as it were. So they can have this very strong sense of, in a sense they're pulled by coming to their family, joining their family of faith, across, scattered across the continent. And that is sort of, the contrary impulse to staying at home. So it's a complex set of evolving senses of affinity. I think it's hard to talk about nationalism in the same sense that we do today. Yeah.
Please.
Thank you for another fascinating lecture. I just wanted to wonder about irony. So you mentioned, for example, the experience of the Huguenots moving to being exiled to North Carolina, then becoming themselves slavers. And you've just touched in the previous response on this sort of, actually it's our country that's left us, so really we're not exiles in that true sense. But what sort of mental gymnastics did people of that time go through to, on one hand, feel that they've had to flee something and they've been forced out, but then see another population and not think, well, actually that's kind of like us.
Exactly. I think that the first thing to say in response to that is that this is a world where people believe, although things are challenging that belief, that there is one form of truth, of Christian truth, and that if you don't hold that form of Christian truth, then you are a slave of the devil, as it were, and therefore, you don't need to do the same in return. You don't owe those on the other side anything, because you are the ones who hold the truth. That is, of course, being challenged, though, of course, toleration, about which I've written elsewhere, is a highly ambivalent concept in this period. It's something that people come to begrudgingly, and that is very, very complex, and only slowly comes to be extended to people who are persecuted. You may have been suffering persecution, you may receive toleration, but are you willing to give it to that other community? And I think what is gradually happening is a sense of the relativization of truth. And it's in that context that people can suddenly say, well, we may not agree with their opinions, but they are behaving as we would do in the same situation, and therefore we should give them the same. Yeah.
Thank you again, Alex, for another great lecture. Can I ask perhaps a slightly flippant question, which is that I wonder whether we are hearing the voices and evidence of the devout, the believers. And the corollary of that is, I wonder where the voices of the emphatically, in inverted commas, undevout might be, the quietists, the pragmatists, those who simply want to keep their heads down and have a quiet life.
Yeah. Well, you take me back, Alvin, to where I began my career, which was studying precisely those people who outwardly conformed, refused to go into exile, refused to be martyrs, and found ways of straddling those boundaries, of existing. But I would say that some of those people, at least, are people who themselves are highly conflicted. They're conscientious people living in a world where they're trying to work out how to navigate, these sorts of circumstances. Of course, there are people that, and you might say it's bred by the pluralism that emerges in this context. People who think, well, look, we don't know what the truth is anymore. So actually, is there any truth at all? And those questions about whether Reformation in any sense is an engine atheism and unbelief go on, don't they? Yes, those quiet voices, though, are hard to recover. I did try to recover some of them in the past, but I suppose what one can say there is that one other way of recovering voices is to see what people do, how they behave with their bodies. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Perhaps following on from that question, again, slightly more a lighter question, which is about pirates. And I'm thinking of David Graeber's work from a slightly later period, where in a way the exile is a kind of a space of anarchy and freedom. And I wondered whether in this earlier period, we had Raleigh and those others who were kind of formalized pirates, if you like, but people who sought exile for a certain kind of freedom outside of the constraints of religion or even of order itself.
Yeah, thank you. I confess I have not pursued pirates very far in my work, but they clearly deserve a place. But I think, in a way, I mentioned how transported individuals, criminals, become the subject of a kind of sympathy and a sort of fascination. And I think you could say that pirates, smugglers, they're also caught up in those sorts of discourses that are ambivalent about those on the move, really. But I need to look more into pirates, clearly. Thank you.
Okay. I think perhaps we can draw to a close at this point. So, first of all, I'd like to thank you all for joining us online. Thank you very much also to all the people who've turned up in person and made this such an appreciative feeling audience, and there's been good interaction between the audience and the speaker. I'd like to thank the people on the Gifford Committee. I'd like to thank Louise, who's administered this, and the sound team at the back who've been recording and looking out for us and making sure we have our equipment switched on and so on. But most of all, obviously, I'd like to thank Alexandra for another wonderful lecture. She has already given a little taste of where we're heading next, about travel for missionary and conversion purposes. So this theme of movement and taking and changing emotions, using the body to enact these religious changes will continue. But I'd like you to join with me in expressing our appreciation and thankfulness for Alexandra for her lecture this evening. Thank you very much indeed.